Hi everyone, welcome back to our Classic Tales live stream reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I am your narrator, Libba Beaucham, here at the Northeast Georgia History Center in our Cottrell Digital Studio. And if you're just joining us, I recommend that you go back because we are over halfway through our adventure at this point. But you can go back to our previous videos on our YouTube channel as well as our Facebook videos tab. So when we last left off, we learned something pretty exciting, that Captain Nemo has revealed that there is an underwater passage near the Suez Canal that is going to make their journey a lot faster, but I'm also wondering if it's going to make it a lot more dangerous. We will find out. So we had to stop in the middle of a chapter, so I'm going to back up just a smidge and get to the part where Captain Nemo reveals to Monsieur Aronnax that there is indeed a secret passage. So I'm just going to check our audio, make sure we are good to go. Also need to fix this. There we go. So we had to... All right, sounds like we're good. Let's dive in. I always want to say that. All right. So let's back up just a bit. All right, so this is Captain Nemo speaking. Unfortunately, he continued, I cannot take you through the Suez Canal, but you will be able to see the long jetty of Port Said after tomorrow, when we shall be in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, I exclaimed. Yes, sir. Does that astonish you? What astonishes me is to think that we shall be there the day after tomorrow. Indeed? Yes, Captain, although by this time I ought to have accustomed myself to be surprised at nothing since I have seen and have been on board your boat. But the cause of the surprise? Well, it is the fearful speed you will have to put on the Nautilus if the day after tomorrow she is to be in the Mediterranean, having made the round of Africa and doubled the Cape of Good Hope. Who told you that she would make the round of Africa and double the Cape of Good Hope, sir? Well, unless the Nautilus sails on dry land and passes above the isthmus, or beneath it, Monsieur Aronnax. Beneath it? Certainly, replied Captain Nemo quietly. A long time ago, nature made under this tongue of land what man has this day made on its surface. What? Such a passage exists? Yes, a subterranean passage, which I have named the Arabian Tunnel. It takes us beneath Suez and opens into the Gulf of Pelusium. But this isthmus is composed of nothing but quicksands? To a certain depth, but at 55 yards only, there is a solid layer of rock. Did you discover this passage by chance? I asked, more and more surprised. Chance and reasoning, sir, and by reasoning even more than by chance. Not only does this passage exist, but I have profited by it several times. Without that, I should not have ventured this day into the Impassable Red Sea. I noticed that in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean there existed a certain number of fishes of a kind perfectly identical. Certain of the fact, I asked myself, was it possible that there was no communication between the two seas? If there was, the subterranean current must necessarily run from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. From the sole cause of difference of level, I caught a large number of fishes in the neighborhood of Suez. I passed a copper ring through their tails and threw them back into the sea. Some months later, on the coast of Syria, I caught some of my fish ornamented with the ring. Thus the communication between the two was proved. I then sought for it with my Nautilus. I discovered it, ventured into it, and before long, sir, you too will have passed through my Arabian Tunnel. All right, on to Chapter 5, the Arabian Tunnel. That same evening, in 21 degrees, 30 degrees northern latitude, the Nautilus floated on the surface of the sea, approaching the Arabian coast. I saw Jeddah, the most important counting house of Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and India. I distinguished clearly enough its buildings, the vessels anchored at the quays, and those whose draught of water obliged them to anchor in the roads. The sun, rather low on the horizon, struck full on the houses of the town, bringing out their whiteness. Outside, some wooden cabins, and some made of reeds, showed the quarter inhabited by the Bedouins. Soon Jeddah was shut out from view by the shadows of the night, and the Nautilus found herself under water, slightly phosphorescent. The next day, the 10th of February, we sighted several ships running to windward. The Nautilus returned to its submarine navigation, but at noon, when her bearings were taken, the sea began being deserted. She rose again to her waterline. Accompanied by Ned and Conseil, I seated myself on the platform. The coast on the eastern side looked like a mass faintly printed upon a damp fog. We were leaning on the sides of the pinnace, talking of one thing and another, when Ned Land, stretching out his hand towards a spot on the sea, said, "Do you see anything there, sir?" "No, Ned," I replied, "but I have not your eyes, you know." "Look well," said Ned. "There, on the starboard beam, about the height of the lantern, do you not see a mass which seems to move?" "Certainly," said I, after close attention. "I see something like a long black body on top of the water." And certainly, before the long black object was not more than a mile from us. It looked like a great sandbank deposited in the open sea. It was a gigantic dugong. Ned Land looked eagerly. His eyes shone with covetousness at the sight of the animal. His hand seemed ready to harpoon it. One would have thought he was waiting the moment to throw himself into the sea and attack it in its element. At this instant, Captain Nemo appeared on the platform. He saw the dugong, understood the Canadian's attitude, and, addressing him, said, "If you held a harpoon just now, Master Land, would it not burn your hand?" "Just so, sir. And you would not be sorry to go back for one day to your trade of a fisherman, and to add the cetacean to your list of those you have already killed?" "I should not, sir." "Well, you can try." "Thank you, sir," said Ned Land, his eyes flaming. "Only," continued the captain, "I advise you, for your own sake, not to miss the creature." "Is the dugong dangerous to attack?" I asked, in spite of the Canadian's shrug of his shoulders. "Yes," replied the captain. "Sometimes the animal turns upon its assailants and overturns their boat. But for Master Land, this danger is not to be feared. His eye is prompt, his arm sure." At this moment, 7 men of the crew, mute and immovable as ever, mounted the platform. One carried a harpoon and a line similar to those employed in catching whales. The pinnace was lifted from the bridge, pulled from its socket, and let down into the sea. 6 oarsmen took their seats, and the coxswain went to the tiller. Next, Ned, Conseil, and I went to the back of the boat. "You are not coming, Captain?" I asked. "No, sir, but I wish you good sport." The boat put off, and lifted by the 6 rowers, drew rapidly towards the dugong, which floated about 2 miles from the Nautilus. Arrived some cable's length from the cetacean, the speed slackened, and the oars dipped noiselessly into the quiet waters. Ned Land, harpoon in hand, stood in the forepart of the boat. The harpoon used for striking the whale is generally attached to a very long cord, which runs out rapidly at the wounded creature, as the wounded creature draws it after him. But here the cord was not more than 10 fathoms long, and the extremity was attached to a small barrel which, by floating, was to show the course the dugong took under the water. I stood and carefully watched the Canadian's adversary. This dugong, which also bears the name of the halicore, closely resembles the manatee, its oblong body terminated in a lengthened tail, and its lateral fins in perfect fingers. Its difference from the manatee consisted in its upper jaw, which was armed with 2 long and pointed teeth, from which formed on each side diverging tusks. This dugong, which Ned Land was preparing to attack, was of colossal dimensions. It was more than 7 yards long. It did not move and seemed to be sleeping on the waves, which circumstance made it easier to capture. The boat approached within 6 yards of the animal. The oars rested on the rowlocks. I half rose. Ned Land, his body thrown a little back, brandished the harpoon in his experienced hand. Suddenly, a hissing noise was heard, and the dugong disappeared. The harpoon, although thrown with great force, had apparently only struck the water. "Curse it!" exclaimed the Canadian furiously. "I have missed it!" "No," said I, "the creature is wounded. Look at the blood, but your weapon has not struck its body." "My harpoon! My harpoon!" cried Ned Land. The sailors rowed on, and the coxswain made for the floating barrel. The harpoon regained, we followed in pursuit of the animal. The latter came now and then to the surface to breathe. Its wound had not weakened it, for it shot onwards with great rapidity. The boat, rowed by strong arms, flew on its track. Several times it approached within some few yards, and the Canadian was ready to strike, but the dugong made off with a sudden plunge, and it was impossible to reach it. Imagine the passion which excited impatient Ned Land. He hurled at the unfortunate creature the most energetic expletives in the English tongue. For my part, I was only vexed to see the dugong escape all our attacks. We pursued it without relaxation for an hour, and I began to think it would prove difficult to capture, when the animal, possessed with the perverse idea of vengeance of which he had cause to repent, turned upon the pinnace and assailed us in its turn. This maneuver did not escape the Canadian. "Look out!" he cried. The coxswain said some words in his outlandish tongue, doubtless warning the men to keep on their guard. The dugong came within 20 feet of the boat, stopped, sniffed the air briskly with its large nostrils, not pierced at the extremity, but in the upper part of its muzzle. Then, taking a spring, he threw himself upon us. The pinnace could not avoid the shock, and half upset, shipped at least 2 tons of water, which had to be emptied, but thanks to the coxswain, we caught it sideways, not full front, so we were not quite overturned. While Ned Land, clinging to the bows, belabored the gigantic animal with blows from his harpoon, the creature's teeth were buried in the gunwale, and it lifted the whole thing out of the water as a lion does a roebuck. We were upset over one another, and I know not how the adventure would have ended if the Canadian, still enraged with the beast, had not struck it to the heart. I heard its teeth grind on the iron plate, and the dugong disappeared, carrying the harpoon with him. But the barrel soon returned to the surface, and shortly after the body of the animal turned on its back. The boat came up with it, took it in tow, and made straight for the Nautilus. It required tackle of enormous strength to hoist the dugong onto the platform. It weighed 10,000 pounds. The next day, 11th of February, the larder of the Nautilus was enriched by some more delicate game. A flight of sea swallows rested on the Nautilus. It was a species of the Sterna nilotica, peculiar to Egypt. Its beak is black, head gray and pointed, the eye surrounded by white spots, the back, wings, and tail of a grayish color, the belly and throat white, and claws red. They also took some dozen of Nile ducks, a wild bird of high flavor, its throat and upper part of the head white with black spots. About 5 o'clock in the evening, we sighted to the north the Cape of Ras Mohammed. This cape forms the extremity of Arabia Petraea, comprised between the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. The Nautilus penetrated into the Straits of Gibraltar, which leads to the Gulf of Suez. I distinctly saw a high mountain towering between the 2 gulfs of Ras Mohammed. It was Mount Horeb, that Sinai, at the top of which Moses saw God face to face. At 6 o'clock, the Nautilus, sometimes floating, sometimes immersed, passed some distance from Tor, situated at the end of the bay, the waters of which seemed tinted with red, an observation already made by Captain Nemo. Then night fell in the midst of a heavy silence, sometimes broken by the cries of the pelican and other night birds, and the noise of the waves breaking upon the shore, chafing against the rocks, or the panting of some far-off steamer between the waters of the Gulf with its noisy paddles. From 8 to 9 o'clock, the Nautilus remained some fathoms under the water. According to my calculation, we must have been very near Suez. Through the panel of the saloon, I saw the bottom of the rocks brilliantly lit up by our electric lamp. We seemed to be leaving the straits behind us more and more. At 9:15, the vessel having returned to the surface, I mounted the platform. Most impatient to pass through Captain Nemo's tunnel, I could not stay in one place, so came to breathe the fresh night air. Soon in the shadow, I saw a pale light, half discolored by the fog, shining about a mile from us. "A floating lighthouse," said someone near me. I turned and saw the captain. "It is the floating light of Suez," he continued. "It will not be long before we gain the entrance of the tunnel. The entrance cannot be easy. No, sir, for that reason I am accustomed to go into the steersman's cage and myself direct our course. And now, if you will go down, Monsieur Aronnax, the Nautilus is going under the waves and will not return to the surface until we have passed through the Arabian Tunnel. Captain Nemo led me towards the central staircase. Halfway down, he opened a door, traversed the upper deck, and landed in the pilot's cage, which it may be remembered rose at the extremity of the platform. It was a cabin measuring 6 feet square, very much like that occupied by the captain on the steamboats of the Mississippi or Hudson. In the midst worked a wheel placed vertically and caught to the tiller rope which ran to the back of the Nautilus. 4 light ports with lenticular glasses let in a groove in the partition of the cabin, allowed the man at the wheel to see in all directions. This cabin was dark, but soon my eyes accustomed themselves to the obscurity, and I perceived the pilot, a strong man, with his hands resting on the spokes of the wheel. Outside, the sea appeared vividly lit up by the lantern, which shed its rays from the back of the cabin to the other extremity of the platform. "Now," said Captain Nemo, "let us try to make our passage." Electric wires connected the pilot's cage with the machinery room, and from there the captain could communicate simultaneously to his Nautilus the direction and the speed. He pressed a metal knob, and at once the speed of the screw diminished. I looked in silence at the high, straight wall we were running by at this moment, the immovable base of a massive sandy coast. We followed it thus for an hour, only some few yards off. Captain Nemo did not take his eye from the knob, suspended by its 2 concentric circles in the cabin. At a simple gesture, the pilot modified the course of the Nautilus every instant. I had placed myself at the port scuttle, and some magnificent substructures of coral, zoophyte, seaweed, and fucus, agitating their enormous claws, which stretched out from the fissures of the rock. At 10:15, the captain himself took the helm. A large gallery, black and deep, opened before us. The Nautilus went boldly into it. A strange roaring was heard round its sides. It was the waters of the Red Sea, which the incline of the tunnel precipitated violently towards the Mediterranean. The Nautilus went with the torrent, rapid as an arrow, in spite of the efforts of the machinery, which, in order to offer more effective resistance, beat the waves with reversed screw. On the walls of the narrow passage I could see nothing but brilliant rays, straight lines, furrows of fire, traced by the great speed under the brilliant electric light. My heart beat fast. At 10:35, Captain Nemo quitted the helm and, turning to me, said, "The Mediterranean." In less than 20 minutes, the Nautilus, carried along by the torrent, had passed through the Isthmus of Suez. All right, on to Chapter 6, the Grecian Archipelago. Oh, yes, and you're welcome, Tootsie. Yes, I'll make sure that the script is this size going forward. So y'all can read along, especially when we come to words I am not familiar with. All right, so the Grecian Archipelago. The next day, the 12th of February, at the dawn of day, the Nautilus rose to the surface. I hastened onto the platform. 3 miles to the south, the dim outline of Pelusium was to be seen. A torrent had carried us from one sea to another. About 7 o'clock, Ned and Conseil joined me. "Well, sir naturalist," said the Canadian in a slightly jovial tone, "and the Mediterranean?" "We are floating on its surface, friend Ned." "What?" said Conseil. "This very night?" "Yes, this very night. In a few minutes we have passed this impassable isthmus." "I do not believe it," replied the Canadian. "Then you are wrong, Master Land," I continued. "This low coast which rounds off to the south is the Egyptian coast, and you, who have such good eyes, Ned, you can see the jetty of Port Said stretching into the sea." The Canadian looked attentively. "Certainly, you are right, sir, and your captain is a first-rate man. We are in the Mediterranean." "Good. Now, if you please, let us talk of our own little affair, but so that no one hears us." I saw what the Canadian wanted, and in any case, I thought it better to let him talk as he wished it. So we all 3 went and sat down near the lantern, where we were less exposed to the spray of the blades. "Now, Ned, we listen. What have you to tell us?" What I have to tell you is very simple. We are in Europe, and before Captain Nemo's caprices drag us once more to the bottom of the polar seas or lead us into Oceania, I ask to leave the Nautilus. I wished in no way to shackle the liberty of my companions, but I certainly felt no desire to leave Captain Nemo. Thanks to him and thanks to this apparatus, I was each day nearer the completion of my submarine studies, and I was rewriting my book of submarine depths in its very element. Should I ever again have such an opportunity of observing the wonders of the ocean? No, certainly not. And I could not bring myself to the idea of abandoning the Nautilus before the cycle of investigation was accomplished. Friend Ned, answer me frankly. Are you tired of being on board? Are you sorry that destiny has thrown us into Captain Nemo's hands? The Canadian remained some moments without answering. Then, crossing his arms, he said, "Frankly, I do not regret this journey under the seas. I shall be glad to have made it. But now that it is made, let us have done with it. That is my idea." "It will come to an end, Ned. Where and when?" "Where, I do not know. When, I cannot say. Or rather, I suppose it will end when the seas have nothing more to teach us." "Then what do you hope for?" demanded the Canadian. "That circumstances may occur as well 6 months hence as now, by which we may and ought to profit." "Oh," said Ned Land, "and where shall we be in 6 months, if you please, Sir Naturalist?" "Perhaps in China. You know the Nautilus is a rapid traveler. It goes through water as swallows through the air, or as an express on the land. It does not fear frequented seas. Who can say that it may not beat the coasts of France, England, or America, on which flight may be attempted as advantageously as here?" "Monsieur Aronnax," replied the Canadian, "your arguments are rotten at the foundation. You speak in the future. We shall be there. We shall be here. I speak in the present. We are here, and we must profit by it." Ned Land's logic pressed me hard, and I felt myself beaten on that ground. I knew not what argument would now tell in my favor. "Sir," continued Ned, "let us suppose an impossibility. If Captain Nemo should this day offer you your liberty, would you accept it?" "I do not know," I answered. "And if," he added, "the offer made you this day was never to be renewed, would you accept it?" "Friend Ned, this is my answer. Your reasoning is against me. We must not rely on Captain Nemo's goodwill. Common prudence forbids him to set us at liberty. On the other side, prudence bids us profit by the first opportunity to leave the Nautilus." "Well, Monsieur Aronnax, that is wisely said." "Only one observation, just one. The occasion must be serious, and our first attempt must succeed. If it fails, we shall never find another, and Captain Nemo will never forgive us." "All that is true," replied the Canadian, "but your observation applies equally to all attempts at flight, whether in 2 years' time or in 2 days. But the question is still this: if a favorable opportunity presents itself, it must be seized." "Agreed. And now, Ned, will you tell me what you mean by a favorable opportunity?" "It will be that which, on a dark night, will bring the Nautilus a short distance from some European coast. And you will try and save yourself by swimming? Yes, if we were near enough to the bank, and if the vessel was floating at the time. Not if the bank was far away and the boat was under the water. And in that case, I should seek to make myself master of the pinnace. I know how it was worked. We must set aside, and the bolts once drawn, we shall come to the surface of the water without even the pilot, who is in the bows, perceiving our flight. Well, Ned, watch for the opportunity, but do not forget that a hitch will ruin us." "I will not forget, sir." "And now, Ned, would you like to know what I think of your project?" "Certainly, Monsieur Aronnax." "Well, I do not say I hope, I think that this favorable opportunity will never present itself." "Why not?" "Because Captain Nemo cannot hide from himself that we have not given up all hope of regaining our liberty, and he will be on his guard, above all, in the seas and in the sight of European coasts." "We shall see," replied Ned Land, shaking his head determinedly. "And now, Ned Land," I added, "let us stop here. Not another word on the subject. The day that you are ready, come and let us know, and we will follow you. I rely entirely upon you." Thus ended a conversation which, at no very distant time, led to such grave results. I must say here that facts seem to confirm my foresight, to the Canadians' great despair. Did Captain Nemo distrust us in these frequented seas, or did he only wish to hide himself from the numerous vessels of all nations which plowed the Mediterranean? I could not tell, but we were oftener between waters and far from the coast. Or, if the Nautilus did emerge, nothing was to be seen but the pilot's cage, and sometimes it went to great depths, for between the Grecian Archipelago and Asia Minor, we could not touch the bottom by more than 1,000 fathoms. Thus, I only knew we were near the island of Carpathos, one of the Sporades, by Captain Nemo reciting these lines from Virgil. Est Carpathio Neptuni gurgite vates, ceruleus Proteus, as he pointed to a spot on the planisphere. It was indeed the ancient abode of Proteus, the old shepherd of Neptune's flocks, now the island of Scarpanto, situated between Rhodes and Crete. I saw nothing but the granite base through the glass panels of the saloon. The next day, the 14th of February, I resolved to employ some hours in studying the fishes of the archipelago, but for some reason or other the panels remained hermetically sealed. Upon taking the course of the Nautilus, I found that we were going towards Candia, the ancient isle of Crete. At the time I embarked on the Abraham Lincoln, the whole of this island had risen in insurrection against the despotism of the Turks. But how the insurgents had fared since that time I was absolutely ignorant, and it was not Captain Nemo, deprived of all land communications, who could tell me. I made no allusion to this event when that night I found myself alone with him in the saloon. Besides, he seemed to be taciturn and preoccupied. Then, contrary to his custom, he ordered both panels to be opened, and going from one to the other, observed the mass of waters attentively. To what end I could not guess, so, on my side, I employed my time in studying the fish passing before my eyes. In the midst of the waters, a man appeared, a diver, carrying at his belt a leathern purse. It was not a body abandoned to the waves. It was a living man, swimming with a strong hand, disappearing occasionally to take breath at the surface. I turned towards Captain Nemo and, in an agitated voice, exclaimed, "A man shipwrecked! He must be saved at any price!" The captain did not answer me, but he came and leaned against the panel. The man had approached and, with his face flattened against the glass, was looking at us. To my great amazement, Captain Nemo signed to him. The diver answered with his hand, mounted immediately to the surface of the water, and did not appear again. "Do not be uncomfortable," said Captain Nemo. "It is Nicholas of Cape Matapan, surnamed Pesca. He is well known in all the Cyclades, a bold diver, water in his element, and he lives more in it than on land, going continually from one island to another, even as far as Crete." "You know him, Captain?" "Why not, Monsieur Aronnax?" Saying which, Captain Nemo went towards a piece of furniture standing near the left panel of the saloon. Near this piece of furniture I saw a chest bound with iron, on the cover of which was a copper plate bearing the cipher of the Nautilus with its device. At that moment, the captain, without noticing my presence, opened the piece of furniture, a sort of strong box which held a great many ingots. Let's see what that is. A block of steel, gold, silver, or other metal, typically in oblong shape. All right. Ingots. They were ingots of gold, from whence came this precious metal which represented an enormous sum? Where did the captain gather this gold from, and what was he going to do with it? I did not say one word. I looked. Captain Nemo took the ingots one by one and arranged them methodically in the chest, which he filled entirely. I estimated the contents at more than 4,000 pounds weight of gold. That is to say, nearly 200,000 pounds sterling. The chest was securely fastened, and the captain wrote an address on the lid in characters which must have belonged to modern Greece. This done, Captain Nemo pressed a knob, the wire of which communicated with the quarters of the crew. 4 men appeared and, not without some trouble, pushed the chest out of the saloon. Then I heard them hoisting it up the iron staircase by means of pulleys. At that moment Captain Nemo turned to me. "And you were saying, sir," said he. I was saying nothing, Captain. Then, sir, if you will allow me, I wish you good night. Whereupon he turned and left the saloon. I returned to my room, much troubled, as one may believe. I vainly tried to sleep. I sought the connecting link between the apparition of the diver and the chest filled with gold. Soon I felt by certain movements of pitching and tossing that the Nautilus was leaving the depths and returning to the sea. Then I heard steps upon the platform, and I knew they were unfastening the pinnace and launching it upon the waves. For one instant it struck the side of the Nautilus, then all noise ceased. 2 hours after, the same noise, the same going and coming was renewed. The boat was hoisted on board, replaced in its socket, and the Nautilus again plunged under the waves. So these millions had been transported to their address. To what point of the continent? Who was Captain Nemo's correspondent? The next day I related to Conseil and the Canadian the events of the night, which had excited my curiosity to the highest degree. My companions were not less surprised than myself. "But where does he take his millions to?" asked Ned Land. To that there was no possible answer. I returned to the saloon after having breakfast and set to work. Till 5 o'clock in the evening I employed myself in arranging my notes. At that moment, ought I to attribute it to some peculiar idiosyncrasy, I felt so great a heat that I was obliged to take off my coat. It was strange, for we were under low latitudes, and even then the Nautilus, submerged as it was, ought to experience no change in temperature. I looked at the manometer. It showed a depth of 60 feet, to which atmospheric heat could never attain. I continued my work, but the temperature rose to such a pitch as to be intolerable. Could there be fire on board? I asked myself. I was leaving the saloon when Captain Nemo entered. He approached the thermometer, consulted it, and turning to me said, 42 degrees. "I have noticed it, Captain," I replied, "and if it gets much hotter, we cannot bear it." "Oh, sir, it will not get better if we do not wish it." "You can reduce it as you please, then?" "No, but I can go farther from the stove which produces it." "It is outward, then?" "Certainly. We are floating in a current of boiling water." "It is impossible." "Is it possible?" I exclaimed. "Look." The panels opened, and I saw the sea entirely white all around. A sulphurous smoke was curling amid the waves, which boiled like water in a copper. I placed my hand on one of the panes of glass, but the heat was so great that I quickly took it off again. "Where are we?" "Near the island of Santorin, sir," replied the captain. "I wish to give you a sight of the curious spectacle of a submarine eruption." "I thought," said I, "that the formation of these new islands was ended." "Nothing is ever ended in the volcanic parts of the sea," replied Captain Nemo, "and the globe is always being worked by subterranean fires. Already, in the 19th year of our era, according to Cassiodorus and Pliny, a new island, Thea the Divine, appeared in the very place where these islets have recently been formed. Then they sank under the waves to rise again in the year 69, when they again subsided. Since that time to our days, the Plutonian work has been suspended, but on the 3rd of January, 1866, a new island, which they named George Island, emerged from the midst of the sulphurous vapor near Nea Kamenni, and settled again the 6th of the same month. 7 days after, the 13th of February, the island of Aphroessa appeared, leaving between Nea Kamenni and itself a canal 10 yards broad. I was in these seas when the phenomenon occurred, and I was able, therefore, to observe all the different phases. The island of Aphroessa, of round form, measured 300 feet in diameter and 30 feet in height. It was composed of black and vitreous lava formed with fragments of felspar. And lastly, on the 10th of March, a smaller island called Reka showed itself near Nea Kamenni. And since then, these three have joined together, forming but one and the same island. "And the canal in which we are at this moment?" I asked. "Here it is," replied Captain Nemo, showing me a map at the archipelago. "You see, I have marked the new islands." I returned to the glass. The Nautilus was no longer moving. The heat was becoming unbearable. The sea, which till now had been white, was red, owing to the presence of salts of iron. In spite of the ships being hermetically sealed, an insupportable smell of sulfur filled the saloon, and the brilliancy of the electricity was entirely extinguished by bright scarlet flames. I was in a bath. I was choking. I was broiled. We can no longer remain in this boiling water, said I to the captain. It would not be prudent, replied the impassive Captain Nemo. An order was given, the Nautilus tacked about and left the furnace it could not brave with impunity. A quarter of an hour after, we were breathing fresh air on the surface. The thought then struck me that if Ned Land had chosen this part of the sea for our flight, we should have never come out alive out of this sea of fire. And the next day, the 16th of February, we left the basin, which between Rhodes and Alexandria is reckoned about 1,500 fathoms in depth, and the Nautilus, passing some distance from Cerigo, quitted the Grecian Archipelago after having doubled Cape Matapan. All right, let's continue on to Chapter 7. The Mediterranean in 48 hours. The Mediterranean, the blue sea par excellence, the great sea of the Hebrews, the sea of the Greeks, the Mare Nostrum of the Romans, bordered by orange trees, aloes, cacti, and sea pines, embalmed with perfume of the myrtle, surrounded by rude mountains, saturated with pure and transparent air, but incessantly worked by underground fires, a perfect battlefield in which Neptune and Pluto still dispute the empire of the world. It is upon these banks and on these waters, says Michelet, that man is renewed in one of the most powerful climates of the globe. But, beautiful as it was, I could only take a rapid glance at the basin, whose superficial area is 2 million of square yards. Even Captain Nemo's knowledge was lost to me, for this puzzling person did not appear once during our passage at full speed. I estimated the course which the Nautilus took under the waves of the sea at about 600 leagues, and it was accomplished in 48 hours. Starting on the morning of the 16th of February from the shores of Greece, we had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar by sunrise on the 18th. It was plain to me that this Mediterranean, enclosed in the midst of those countries which he wished to avoid, was distasteful to Captain Nemo. Those waves and those breezes brought back too many remembrances, if not too many regrets. Here he had no longer that independence and that liberty of gait which he had when in the open seas, and his Nautilus felt itself cramped between the close shores of Africa and Europe. Our speed was now 25 miles an hour. It may be well understood that Ned Land, to his great disgust, was obliged to renounce his intended flight. He could not launch the pinnace, which, going at a rate of 12 or 13 yards every second, to quit the Nautilus under such conditions would be as bad as jumping from a train going at full speed, an imprudent thing, to say the least of it. Besides, our vessel only mounted to the surface of the waves at night to renew its stock of air. It was steered entirely by the compass and the log. I saw no more of the interior of this Mediterranean than a traveler by express train perceives of the landscape which flies before his eyes, that is to say, the distant horizon, and not the nearer objects which pass like a flash of lightning. We were then passing between Sicily and the coast of Tunis. In the narrow space between Cape Bon and the Straits of Messina, the bottom of the sea rose almost suddenly. There was a perfect bank on which there was not more than 9 fathoms of water, whilst on either side the depth was 90 fathoms. The Nautilus had to maneuver very carefully so as not to strike against this submarine barrier. I showed Conseil on the map of the Mediterranean the spot occupied by this reef. "But if you please, sir," observed Conseil, "it is like a real isthmus joining Europe to Africa. Yes, my boy, it forms a perfect bar to the Straits of Libya, and the soundings of Smith have proved that in former times the continents between Cape Beaucham and Cape Fiorina were joined." "I can well believe it," said Conseil. "I will add," I continued, "that a similar barrier exists between Gibraltar and Ceuta, which in geological times formed the entire Mediterranean. What if some volcanic burst should one day raise these 2 barriers above the waves? It is not probable, Conseil." "Well, but allow me to finish, please, sir. If this phenomenon should take place, it will be troublesome for Monsieur Lesseps, who has taken so much pains to pierce the isthmus." I agree with you, but I repeat, Conseil, this phenomenon will never happen. The violence of the subterranean force is ever diminishing. Volcanoes, so plentiful in the first days of the world, are being extinguished by degrees. The internal heat is weakened. The temperature of the lower strata of the globe is lowered by a perceptible quantity every century, to the detriment of our globe, for its heat is its life. But the sun? The sun is not sufficient to conceal. Can it give heat to a dead body? Not that I know of. Well, my friend, the earth will one day be that cold corpse. It will become uninhabitable and uninhabited like the moon, which has long since lost all its vital heat. In how many centuries? In some hundreds of thousands of years, my boy. Then, said Conseil, we shall have time to finish our journey, that is, if Ned Land does not interfere with it. And Conseil, reassured, returned to the study of the bank, which the Nautilus was skirting at a moderate speed. During the night of the 16th and 17th of February, we had entered the second Mediterranean basin, the greatest depth of which was 1,450 fathoms. The Nautilus, by the action of its crew, slid down the inclined planes and buried itself in the lowest depths of the sea. On the 18th of February, about 3 o'clock in the morning, we were at the entrance of the Straits of Gibraltar. There once existed two currents, an upper one, long since recognized, which conveys the waters of the ocean into the basin of the Mediterranean, and a lower countercurrent, which reasoning has now shown to exist. Indeed, the volume of water in the Mediterranean, incessantly added to by the waves of the Atlantic and by rivers falling into it, would each year raise the level of this sea, for its evaporation is not sufficient to restore the equilibrium. As it is not so, we must necessarily admit the existence of an undercurrent, which empties into the basin of the Atlantic through the Straits of Gibraltar, the surplus waters of the Mediterranean. A fact indeed, and it was this counter-current by which the Nautilus profited. It advanced rapidly by the narrow pass. For one instant I caught a glimpse of the beautiful ruins of the Temple of Hercules, buried in the ground according to Pliny, and with the low island which supports it, and a few minutes later we were floating on the Atlantic. All right, on to Chapter 8, Vigo Bay. The Atlantic, a vast sheet of water whose superficial area covers 25 millions of square miles, the length of which is 9,000 miles, with a mean breadth of 2,700, an ocean whose parallel winding shores embrace an immense circumference watered by the largest rivers of the world, the St. Lawrence, the Mississippi, the Amazon, the Plata, the Orinoco, the Niger, the Senegal, the Elbe, the Loire, and the Rhine, which carry water from the most civilized as well from the most savage countries. Magnificent field of water incessantly plowed by vessels of every nation, sheltered by the flags of every nation, and which terminates in those two terrible points so dreaded by mariners, Cape Horn and the Cape of Tempests. The Nautilus was piercing the water with its sharp spur after having accomplished nearly 10,000 leagues in 3 months and a half, a distance greater than the great circle of the earth. Where were we going now, and what was reserved for the future? The Nautilus, leaving the Straits of Gibraltar, had gone far out. It returned to the surface of the waves, and our daily walks on the platform were restored to us. I mounted at once, accompanied by Ned Land and Conseil. At a distance of about 12 miles, Cape St. Vincent was dimly to be seen, forming the southwestern point of the Spanish peninsula. A strong southerly gale was blowing. The sea was swollen and billowy. It made the Nautilus rock violently. It was almost impossible to keep one's foot on the platform, which the heavy rolls of the sea beat over every instant. So we descended after inhaling some mouthfuls of fresh air. I returned to my room, Conseil to his cabin, but the Canadian, with a preoccupied air, followed me. Our rapid passage across the Mediterranean had not allowed him to put his project into execution, and he could not help showing his disappointment. When the door of my room was shut, he sat down and looked at me silently. "Friend Ned," said I understand you, but you cannot reproach yourself. To have attempted to leave the Nautilus under the circumstances would have been folly." Ned Land did not answer. He compressed his lips, and frowning brow showed with him the violent possession this fixed idea had taken of his mind. Let us see, I continued. We not need despair yet. We are going up the coast of Portugal again. France and England are not far off, where we can easily find refuge. Now, if the Nautilus, on leaving the Straits of Gibraltar, had gone to the south, if it had carried us towards regions where there were no continents, I should share your uneasiness. But we know now that Captain Nemo does not fly from civilized seas, and in some days I think you can act with security. Ned Land still looked at me fixedly. At length his fixed lips parted, and he said, "It is for tonight." I drew myself up suddenly. I admitted, little prepared for this communication. I wanted to answer the Canadian, but words would not come. "We agreed to wait for an opportunity," continued Ned Land, "and the opportunity has arrived. This night we shall be but a few miles from the Spanish coast. It is cloudy. The wind blows freely. I have your word, Monsieur Aronnax, and I rely upon you." As I was silent, the Canadian approached me. "Tonight, at 9 o'clock, said he, "I have warned Conseil. At that moment Captain Nemo will be shut up in his room, probably in bed. Neither the engineers nor the ship's crew can see us. Conseil and I will gain the central staircase, and you, Monsieur Aronnax, will remain in the library, 2 steps from us, waiting my signal. The oars, the mast, and the sail are in the canoe. I have even succeeded in getting some provisions. I have procured an English wrench to unfasten the bolts which attach it to the shell of the Nautilus, so all is ready, till tonight." "The sea is bad." "That I allow," replied the Canadian, "but we must risk that. Liberty is worth paying for. Besides, the boat is strong, and a few miles with a fair wind to carry us is no great thing. Who knows, but by tomorrow we may be 100 leagues away. Let circumstances only favor us, and by 10 or 11 o'clock we shall have landed on some spot of terra firma, alive or dead. But adieu, now, till tonight." With these words the Canadian withdrew, leaving me almost dumb. I had imagined that, the chance gone, I should have time to reflect and discuss the matter. My obstinate companion had given me no time, and after all, what could I have said to him? Ned Land was perfectly right. There was almost the opportunity to profit by. Could I retract my word and take upon myself the responsibility of compromising the future of my companions? Tomorrow Captain Nemo might take us far from all land. At that moment, a rather loud hissing noise told me that the reservoirs were filling, and that the Nautilus was sinking under the waves of the Atlantic. A sad day I passed between the desire of regaining my freedom of action and of abandoning the wonderful Nautilus and leaving my submarine studies incomplete. What dreadful hours I passed thus, sometimes seeing myself and companions safely landed, sometimes wishing, in spite of my reason, that some unforeseen circumstance would prevent the realization of Ned Land's project. Twice I went to the saloon. I wished to consult the compass. I wished to see if the direction of the Nautilus was bringing us nearer or taking us farther from the coast, but no, the Nautilus kept in Portuguese waters. I must therefore take my part and prepare for flight. My luggage was not heavy, my notes nothing more. As to Captain Nemo, I asked myself what he would think of our escape, what trouble, what wrong it might cause him, and what he might do in case of its discovery or failure. Certainly I had no cause to complain of him. On the contrary, never was hospitality freer than his. In leaving him, I could not be taxed with ingratitude. No oath bound us to him. It was on the strength of circumstances he relied, and not upon our word to fix us forever. I had not seen the captain since our visit to the island of Santorin. Would chance bring me to his presence before our departure? I wished it, and I feared it at the same time. I listened if I could hear him walking the room contiguous to mine. No sound reached my ear. I felt an unbearable uneasiness. This day of waiting seemed eternal. Hours struck too slowly to keep pace with my impatience. My dinner was served in my room as usual. I ate but little. I was too preoccupied. I left the table at 7 o'clock. 120 minutes, I counted them, still separated me from the moment in which I was to join Ned Land. My agitation redoubled. My pulse beat violently. I could not remain quiet. I went and came, hoping to calm my troubled spirit by constant movement. The idea of failure in our bold enterprise was the least painful of my anxieties, but the thought of seeing our project discovered before the leaving of the Nautilus, of being brought before Captain Nemo, irritated, or, what was worse, saddened at my desertion, made my heart beat. I wanted to see the saloon for the last time. I descended the stairs and arrived in the museum where I had passed so many useful and agreeable hours. I looked at all its riches, all its treasures, like a man on the eve of an eternal exile who was leaving never to return. These wonders of nature, these masterpieces of art, amongst which for so many days my life had been concentrated, I was going to abandon them forever. I should like to have taken a last look through the windows of the saloon into the waters of the Atlantic, but the panels were hermetically closed, and a cloak of steel separated me from the ocean which I had not yet explored. In passing through the saloon, I came near the door let into the angle, which opened into the captain's room. To my great surprise, this door was ajar. I drew back involuntarily. If Captain Nemo should be in his room, he could see me, but hearing no sound, I drew nearer. The room was deserted. I pushed open the door and took some steps forward. Still the same monk-like severity of aspect. Suddenly the clock struck 8. The first beat of the hammer on the bell awoke me from my dreams. I trembled as if an invisible eye had plunged into my most secret thoughts, and I hurried from the room. There my eye fell upon the compass. Our course was still north. The log indicated moderate speed, the manometer at a depth of about 60 feet. I returned to my room, clothed myself warmly, sea boots, an otter-skin cap, a great coat of byssus, lined with sealskin. I was ready, I was waiting. The vibration of the screw alone broke the deep silence which reigned on board. I listened attentively. Would no loud voice suddenly inform me that Ned Land had been surprised in his projected flight? A mortal dread hung over me, and I vainly tried to regain my accustomed coolness. At a few minutes to 9, I put my ear to the captain's door. No noise. I left my room and returned to the saloon, which was half in obscurity, but deserted. I opened the door communicating with the library. The same insufficient light, the same solitude. I placed myself near the door leading to the central staircase, and there waited for Ned Land's signal. At that moment, the trembling of the screw sensibly diminished, then it stopped entirely. The silence was now only disturbed by the beatings of my own heart. Suddenly, a slight shock was felt, and I knew that the Nautilus had stopped at the bottom of the ocean. My uneasiness increased. The Canadian's signal did not come. I felt inclined to join Ned Land and beg of him to put off his attempt. I felt that we were not sailing under our usual conditions. At this moment, the door of the large saloon opened, and Captain Nemo appeared. He saw me, and without further preamble, began in an amiable tone of voice. "Ah, sir, I have been looking for you. Do you know the history of Spain?" Now, one might know the history of one's own country by heart, but in the condition I was at the time, with troubled mind and head quite lost, I could not have said a word of it. "Well," Captain Nemo continued, "you heard my question. Do you know the history of Spain?" "Very slightly," I answered. "Well, here are learned men having to learn," said the captain. "Come, sit down, and I will tell you a curious episode in this history. Sir, listen well," said he. "This history will interest you on one side, for it will answer a question which doubtless you have not been able to solve." "I listen, Captain," said I, not knowing what my interlocutor was driving at, and asking myself if this incident was bearing on our projected flight. "Sir, if you have no objection, we will go back to 1702. You cannot be ignorant that your king, Louis XIV, thinking that the gesture of a potentate was sufficient to bring the Pyrenees under his yoke, had imposed the Duke of Anjou, his grandson, on the Spaniards. This prince reigned more or less badly under the name of Philip V, and had a strong party against him abroad. Indeed, the preceding year, the royal houses of Holland, Austria, and England had concluded a treaty of alliance at The Hague, with the intention of plucking the crown of Spain from the head of Philip V, and placing it on that of an archduke to whom they prematurely gave the title of Charles III. Spain must resist this coalition, but she was almost entirely unprovided with either soldiers or sailors. However, money would not fail them, provided that their galleons, laden with gold and silver from America, once entered their ports. And about the end of 1702, they expected a rich convoy, which France was escorting with a fleet of 23 vessels, commanded by Admiral Chateau-Renaud. For the ships of the coalition were already beating the Atlantic. This convoy was to go to Cadiz with the admiral, hearing that an English fleet was cruising in those waters, resolved to make for a French port. The Spanish commanders of the convoy objected to this decision. They wanted to be taken to a Spanish port, and, if not to Cadiz, into Vigo Bay, situated on the northwest coast of Spain, and which was not blocked. Admiral Chateau-Renaud had the rashness to obey this injunction, and the galleons entered Vigo Bay. Unfortunately, it formed an open road which could not be defended in any way. They must therefore hasten to unload the galleons before the arrival of the combined fleet, and time would not have failed them had not a miserable question of rivalry suddenly arisen. "Are you following the chain of events?" asked Captain Nemo. "Perfectly," said I, not knowing the end proposed by this historical lesson. "I will continue. This is what passed. The merchants of Cadiz had a privilege by which they had the right of receiving all merchandise coming from the West Indies. Now, to disembark these ingots at the port of Vigo was depriving them of their rights. They complained at Madrid, and obtained the consent of the weak-minded Philip that the convoy, without discharging its cargo, should remain sequestered in the roads of Vigo until the enemy had disappeared. But, whilst coming to this decision on the 22nd of October, 1702, the English vessels arrived in Vigo Bay, when Admiral Chateau-Renaud, in spite of inferior forces, fought bravely. But, seeing that the treasure must fall into the enemy's hands, he burnt and scuttled every galleon, which went to the bottom with their immense riches." Captain Nemo stopped. I admit I could not see why this history should interest me. "Well?" I asked. "Well, Monsieur Aronnax," replied Captain Nemo, "we are in that Vigo Bay, and it rests with yourself whether you will penetrate its mysteries." The captain rose, telling me to follow him. I had had time to recover. I obeyed. The saloon was dark, but through the transparent glass the waves were sparkling. I looked. For half a mile around the Nautilus the waters seemed bathed in electric light. The sandy bottom was clean and bright. Some of the ship's crews, in their diving dresses, were clearing away half-rotten barrels and empty cases from the midst of the blackened wrecks. From these cases and from the barrels escaped ingots of gold and silver, cascades of piastres and Jules. The sand was heaped up with them. Laden with their precious booty, the men returned to the Nautilus, disposed of their burden, and went back to the inexhaustible fishery of gold and silver. I understood now. This was the scene of the battle of the 22nd of October, 1702. Here, on this very spot, the galleons laden for the Spanish government had sunk. Here Captain Nemo came, according to his wants, to pack up those millions with which he burdened the Nautilus. It was for him and him alone America had given up her precious metals. He was heir direct, without anyone to share in those treasures torn from the Incas and from the conquered of Ferdinand Cortez. "Did you know, sir," he asked, smiling, "that the sea contained such riches?" "I knew," I answered, "that they value money held in suspension in these waters at 2 millions. Doubtless, but to extract this money the expense would be greater than the profit. Here, on the contrary, I have but to pick up what man has lost, and not only in Vigo Bay, but in 1,000 other ports where shipwrecks have happened, and which are marked on my submarine map. Can you understand now the source of the millions I am worth?" "I understand, Captain, but allow me to tell you that in exploring Vigo Bay you have only been beforehand with a rival society." "And which?" "A society which has received from the Spanish government the privilege of seeking those buried galleons. The shareholders are led on by the allurement of an enormous bounty, for they value these rich shipwrecks at 500 millions. 500 millions they were," answered Captain Nemo, "but they are so no longer." "Just so," said I, "and a warning to those shareholders would be an act of charity, but who knows if it would be well received? What gamblers usually regret above all else is less the loss of their money than of their foolish hopes. After all, I pity them less than the thousands of unfortunates to whom so much riches, well distributed, would have been profitable, whilst for them they will be forever barren. I had no sooner expressed this regret than I felt that it must have wounded Captain Nemo. "Barren!" he exclaimed with animation. "Do you think, then, sir, that these riches are lost because I gather them? Is it for myself alone, according to your idea, that I take the trouble to collect these treasures? Who told you that I did not make a good use of it? Do you think I am ignorant that there are suffering beings and oppressed races on this earth, miserable creatures to console, victims to avenge? Do you not understand?" Captain Nemo stopped at these words, regretting perhaps that he had spoken so much, but I guessed that, whatever the motive which had forced him to seek independence under the sea, it had left him still a man, that his heart still beat for the suffering of humanity, and that his immense charity was for oppressed races as well as individuals. And then I understood for whom those millions were destined, which were forwarded by Captain Nemo when the Nautilus was cruising in the waters of the Crete. All right, we will stop there today. And we will continue tomorrow as usual. Thank you all for joining me. And I also wanted to let you know that we do have a really cool program today. It's going to be the History of Magic and Illusion, and that is at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that's going to be with historians Marie Walker and Glenn Kyle live. And then we also have 2 really great pre-recorded interviews with James Freeman, who is a Houdini memorabilia collector and is very knowledgeable about Harry Houdini, as well as a historian, Leslie Jones, our archives manager, who is a specialist in the area of spiritualism, specifically an early 1900s spiritualism. So think seances and ways to speak with the dead. But she's going to be talking about the techniques that the people leading these seances would use, which, spoiler alert, were not necessarily all that spiritual or magical by nature. So please join us for that. That is at 2 p.m. today. And I also wanted to remind you that we do have our digital memberships available. So if you would like to join us as a digital member, starting next week, we are going to go down to 2 live streams per week. One is going to be for anyone who wants to watch, and the other is going to be specifically for our digital members. So as a digital member, you get a lot of cool benefits. You can request programs. You can get special podcast episodes of ours. There are extra video lessons that we'll provide. Our weekly newsletter, lots and lots of benefits. So, and it's as low as $3 a month or just $35 for the year. Of course, we ask that you give what you can, but you can join for as low as that. So it's a really great opportunity. I put the link in the chat, so click on that and you can learn more. But other than that, thank you so much. I hope to see you today at 2 p.m. for the History of Magic and Illusion. And I'll see you tomorrow to continue our journey onto Chapter 9 of Part 2, A Vanished Continent. All right, see you then.